to talk about native controls in NetSuite. I think we've got some pretty good content for you here focused on NetSuite's 2016.2 release. So let's go ahead and jump in. First off, before we dive into the content here, I wanted to go ahead and throw out a plug for a book that the team at Fastpath here just got published earlier this month, the NetSuite Security and Audit Field Manual. A lot of the content in this book is going to be a much more detailed and much deeper dive of some of what we're covering here on the webinar, including much more. You can get more info from www.gofastpath.com/netsuitebook. And then if you do want a copy of it, feel free to shoot us a tweet and we'll send you a complimentary copy. The book can also be found on Amazon if you search for NetSuite Security. It's pretty much one of the only results that show up. So diving in here, this is going to be our agenda for the webinar this afternoon. The first question is really, why are we talking about native controls in NetSuite? NetSuite's a SaaS product. Doesn't NetSuite themselves take care of most of the controls on the back end? Yes and no. So NetSuite is going to manage the servers. It is going to manage all the databases and the security and compliance for those systems, which is evidenced by their SOC reports. However, there's always going to be elements of internal control that are the responsibility of the consumer. So the purpose of the webinar today is to help identify some of those key complementary user entity controls that exist in NetSuite and try to help you understand how they may apply to your organization. So to do that, we're going to start off by covering logical security. Then we're going to move on and give a quick overview of the security model in NetSuite and how it can be audited. Then we're going to talk about how that security model is applied to users and how you manage that user access going forward. Then we'll dive into system development and the lifecycle that surrounds that, as well as change management. There's going to be customizations in a NetSuite environment. We want to make sure that the proper controls are in place to make sure that those customizations are moving through. Then we'll talk about transactions and how they're going to flow through your NetSuite environment and what controls might be able to be put in place to put some better processing controls around those. And then once we're done with native NetSuite, we'll talk about what Fastpath can offer to make some of these controls a little bit easier to implement. So first off, logical security. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds here to read the objective. So a couple things to note within that objective. One is authentication and authorization. So what is authentication? What is authorization? Well, authentication is the process of making sure a user is who they say they are. So when I go to log into NetSuite, I enter my username and password and provide any additional authentication requirements. That's the process of taking those credentials and mapping me back to an actual NetSuite user. And then authorization, once we know who a user is, it's determining what they can do. So once I've logged into NetSuite, it's determining which NetSuite accounts I have access to and what I can do within each one of those NetSuite accounts. So at a high level, logical security is really just the controls that are making sure user access is properly defined and monitored, while the risks inherent in that access are mitigated. Some of the common challenges that typically pop up around logical security. First off, access security is often a low priority for project teams. They're usually focused on the most efficient way to get their projects completed. It's always going to be easier to assign broad permissions to users. That way you don't have to deal with going through and determining which specific permissions and access levels a user might need. And then users are typically given too much access just out of convenience because, like I said, it's always easier to assign broad security than to actually go through and make the determinations. There's always going to be a balance of user efficiency versus security. Obviously, it's going to be easier to assign broad access, but if you go too far the other way, where you have too many roles, where your access is segregated too much across those roles, at that point you're going to have users with 10, 12, 15 roles assigned to them, and they're going to be switching roles all day in NetSuite trying to do their jobs. Obviously, that's going to lower user efficiency. So we need to try and have a balance between both efficiency and security, and we probably don't want to be one way or the other too far. Another challenge is segregation of duties. So segregation of duties can be a very manual process in NetSuite. There aren't really any great tools in the system currently that are going to allow you to do this on an automated fashion. So if we don't consider SOD, we're going to get to a point where we have users that have access to permissions that they shouldn't have, and it's obviously going to introduce risk into your NetSuite environment. And then just difficulty reporting on current security setup. This can be for a number of reasons, whether users just don't know how, they don't know where to find the data via saved searches or audit trails within NetSuite, or if you have too many customizations, that can make it extremely difficult. If we have roles assigned where users have permissions that are then taken away via customizations and that the actual security is built into scripts within NetSuite or workflows, it can become very difficult to report on that security setup. So now we're just going to go through a brief overview of NetSuite's security model. This might be review for some of you, but if you haven't logged into NetSuite, it should give you at least the base for understanding how security is set up and applied in NetSuite. So we start out with the NetSuite user. A user is going to get the ability to do certain things within NetSuite from permissions. Those permissions are going to be assigned via roles or via global permissions. We'll cover global permissions a little bit further into the presentation. And then permissions themselves are typically going to relate back to either a record, like a transaction, so an invoice, a cash sale, a customer, certain setup features within NetSuite, like the ability to enable or disable NetSuite features or set up accounting preferences. And a permission is going to have a certain access level as well. So view, create, edit, or full. Subsidiaries are going to come into play when if you have a one-world NetSuite account, when determining which subsidiary data a certain user can access, it's going to be granted either at the user level or at the role level, and we'll go into that a little bit further as well. And then it's important to understand that there are multiple user types in NetSuite. There are full users, which are going to be just your regular, accounting or AP clerk that's logging into NetSuite to enter transactions. And then you can have what are called center-based users, which can be external customers that have access to specific components of NetSuite. It can be customers, partners, vendors, contacts that have access to your NetSuite environment. So now we get into how those roles are actually set up. So what we see here is a screenshot of just one of the standard roles that is included typically with NetSuite out of the box. The first thing you'll notice here is there is a center type that's specified. The center is really just the set of tabs or pages that are available in the user interface. So when we specify the accounting center, you're going to see pages and links that are specific to what an accountant would want to see within NetSuite. Where if we choose system administrator, you're going to see stuff like preferences and configuration and user management. Then we get to subsidiaries. Roles can be assigned 0, 1, or many subsidiaries. The subsidiaries you are assigning here are going to determine, once this role is assigned to a user, which subsidiary data they can access within your NetSuite instance. We can set restrictions based on the employee, the department, the class, or the location. Once we set that, the role access to transaction, customer, employee records is at that point going to be based on values on the employee, sales rep, or supervisor fields on those records. And it's going to come down to the employee's supervisor hierarchy themselves or their subordinates, depending on what you set for those restrictions. Then there's various other settings we can put on the role itself to further restrict how the role can be used or which records that role can access. So for example, like do not restrict employee fields. If we set employee restrictions, that's going to restrict more than just the employee records themselves, but you can turn off specifically users with this role to see data in other subsidiaries with the allow cross-subsidiary record viewing. And then you can set how this role is going to be used, whether it's a sales or support role, web services only, single sign-on, or partner role. And that's going to depend, or that's going to determine not only what users can do with that role, but also what instances of records they're going to see. So once we've set up the kind of the base role, at that point we're going to go down and start assigning individual permissions. So permissions are going to be grouped according to what type of permission they are, whether that's a transaction, a report list setup, or your custom records, which custom records, essentially each custom record you create is going to become its own permission that you can assign to roles. Now we also need to specify access levels for each permission. There's 4 different access levels that can be set: view, edit, or view, create, edit, and full. It's important to remember that those are cumulative, so once we're assigning view, if we assign create, it's also going to give view access. Edit gives view, create, and edit, and then full gives view, create, edit, and delete to instances of those record types. So now we've got those roles set up, we've got the permissions assigned to those roles. How do those permissions actually get assigned to users? So there's 2 scenarios here. It's if we assign their role to a user and that role does not have any subsidiaries assigned. At that point, the user is going to get the role's permissions only in their default subsidiary, which is set on the employee record. The next scenario here would be we create a role that has 1 or more subsidiaries assigned to it, and then we assign that role to a user. At the role itself, not their default subsidiary. Apart from roles, we can also use global permissions. Global permissions are essentially one-off permissions that maybe are not included in a role, but we want to assign those directly to a user. Global permissions are a feature that are enabled at the company level. It's not required. It has to be enabled specifically. Once enabled, like I said, they are assigned directly to employees themselves. So on the employee page and the access tab and then the global permissions sub-tab, you can assign individual permissions to those users. It's important to note that global permissions cannot be assigned for custom records. It's only for transactions, reports, lists, setup. So how do those global permissions play with the actual permissions that are included in the role setup? So let's talk about a couple scenarios here. First one would be user has a global permission with check and the access level set to full. And then they also have a role assigned with the check permission and access level set to view. In this case, global permissions are going to take precedence over all other role-based permissions. So even though the role only has view access level to the check permission, since that user has a global permission with the full access level, they're going to have full access to checks. And it goes the other way as well, if I wanted to use global permissions to restrict access to specific permissions. So if we reverse that and I have a role with the check permission and full access level, and I assign a global permission to a user, again with the check permission and view access level, at this point it's going to restrict that user's access for checks down to the view access level. It's also important to note that global permissions are assigned to all the roles, role subsidiaries of a user. So if I log in with a role has access to 4 subsidiaries, all my global permissions are going to apply to those subsidiaries. So now we've got our security model defined and set up within NetSuite. The next step is to do that. Save searches are going to be your best friend here in NetSuite with regards to your role setup. First step is to get a report that's going to return you all the permissions as well as access levels on those roles. Run a save search against the role record type. You can add the permission and the level fields, and that's going to bring back all the permissions on a role as well as the access levels. Permissions are only part of the equation, so we need actually a separate search that's going to return us which subsidiaries a role is going to grant us access to. It's typically best to do this in a separate save search because there could be multiple records per role. If you get in the case where you bring in permissions as well as subsidiaries, you're going to have a bunch of duplicated data. It can be hard to wade through at that point. So again, we're looking at a save search against the role record type with just the subsidiaries field added, which is going to return us all the subsidiary assignments. From there, we want to go through and determine what changes have been made to our security setup. So from there, there's a few different ways that we can do that. First off is a saved search against the role record type that can provide a list of those permission changes. If we add the permission change date, as well as the permission change level, we can start to see a picture of how the permissions have changed over time on a given role. Another way to do this is via the History tab. You'll see the History tab talked about quite a bit in various areas of NetSuite. It's data that cannot be included in a saved search typically, at least in the same fashion that it's on the History tab in. But if we go to the History tab of a given role record, right next to the System Notes, we're going to see History, and it's going to show you similar information, but just grouped in different matter, or in a different manner, and it's going to show you which users were out changing the role definition. Now, it's important to note that there are certain changes that are not going to be reflected in the System Notes or in the History in this case, and that's going to be subsidiary changes on these roles. Next, we need to look at global permission assignments. So again, we can use a saved search here. We're going to be searching against the employee record type. From there, if we add the global permission and global permission fields, we can see those current global permission assignments. So now, and we've also been auditing our security setup. Next step is to manage how the security is assigned back to users. So the first thing we get into is, again, we're going to have that efficiency versus security balance, where, again, assigning broad permissions is probably going to be a little bit easier, but obviously not best practice with regards to security. But going too far in the other direction and having too many roles is going to inhibit user productivity. So we need to determine the best balance there, and that's going to be different for each organization. It's important that we have a consistent process that is documented with audit evidence with regards to user access management. So it's important to note who has access to provision these users, who has access to manage the roles as well, and the permissions included in those roles. And we need to know that this process is well documented. We need to include request, approval routing, assignment, and then maintenance documentation of each action that's taken against our user access. With regards to the administrator and full access roles, these are kind of two superpowered roles within NetSuite. Best practice NetSuite says is to have at least 2 NetSuite administrators. They're going to have access to every single component of your NetSuite instance. The reason you want to have at least 2 is in case one is out for whatever reason. You need to make sure that at least somebody that's available has that access in case there's emergencies. And then full access, very similar to the administrator role. It's going to have a wide variety of the permissions in NetSuite, but not as many as administrator, and full access is documented in the NetSuite Help Center, so you can determine exactly which permissions it has. It's important to remember that admin and full access both do not show up in access reports in NetSuite. The reason for this is they just have basically every permission in the system. So NetSuite decided that it doesn't make sense for them to show up, but you need to be aware of that when you are managing your user access and doing access reviews. One thing to be aware of with regards to administrator is NetSuite is actively segregating out permissions from that role. Currently, there are certain permissions in the administrator role that cannot be assigned to other roles. However, as of the last release, I believe NetSuite segregated out 5 of those permissions, and they intend to keep doing so little by little throughout the future releases. You also need to consider where it might make sense to have additional layers of authentication. So what does that mean exactly? Well, in NetSuite, there's 2 different ways you can do this, at least without a box configuration. One of those is 2-factor authentication. That's where a user is going to authenticate with something they know and something they have. So for example, I go log into NetSuite with my username and password. That's something I know, and then something I have. At that point, NetSuite's going to there's a few different methods, one of which they send you a text message with a code that you then have to input into NetSuite. So that's something you have, right? Your phone, you're receiving text messages. Or you can do that via RSA tokens, at which point you have a separate device that's going to generate those tokens that you then input into NetSuite. It's important to consider using two-factor authentication for some of your roles that might be high access or high risk, such as your administrator or full access roles. You can also apply IP address restrictions to your roles within NetSuite. You can do that at the company level, or you can do that at the individual user level. Basically, you're saying at that point, I only want these users to log in to access NetSuite from specific locations. It's also important to have a review process in place. So once we've got our user access defined, we need to be reviewing that on a regular basis. Often we see quarterly or monthly. We need to be looking for specific things like orphaned users. We need to be validating that access is set up correctly and assigned to the correct users, and then also providing extra scrutiny for those high-risk roles like admin or full access. Next consideration for logical security is segregation of duties. Segregation of duties is a basic internal control that attempts to ensure that no single individual has the authority to execute two or more conflicting sensitive transactions with the potential to impact financial statements. Okay, so how do we do that within NetSuite? Well, it's going to be a very manual process first off. But the typical process for SOD is step one, we generate user access data. We need to go and determine which users have access to the system, what they can do with that access, and best practice is to go down to the subsidiary level because that access could vary between subsidiaries in NetSuite. From there, we need to define what we consider to be risk within that access. In other words, what is our conflict rule set? So typically this includes going through and determining which processes or permissions could negatively impact your organization's financials if they're abused. Assigning the proper rules to those conflicts to determine how those conflicts are generated, and then also associating risk levels against them. One of the best practices here is when you're tackling SOD is to do that with a risk-based approach, starting obviously with high-risk conflicts first and then moving on to the lower risk items. Once we've determined how we define what risk is, the next step there is determining where we have risk in our user access, or where do conflicts exist in that user access. Currently this is going to be a pretty manual process. It's going to involve spreadsheets of user access data, comparing them back to your conflict rule set to determine where conflicts exist. A couple things that are important to consider here is those access level hierarchies. Just remember also how global permissions are coming into play, as well as those subsidiary assignments. So you need to be able to consider that global permissions are going to override your role permissions, and then how subsidiaries are assigned in conjunction with that user's default subsidiary. And once we've determined where we have risk, the final step is asking the question of what are we doing about that risk. So this comes down to documenting where we have mitigating controls. So at this point we're mapping existing controls to the risks identified in our prior steps, and identifying where we still have gaps that may require implementation of additional controls. So the goal here is not necessarily zero conflicts. It's going to be very difficult to get to a point where you have zero SOD conflicts. The goal here is that we have mitigating controls for at least the high-risk conflicts, and eventually mitigating controls for all conflicts. So now how do we audit our user access? So if we go back to SOD, the first step was generating that user access data. Well, here's how we can do that. First off, we're running a search against the employee record type, and we can join to the roles record type to get information about the permissions that are assigned to those users, including the access levels, and also where they're getting that. In other words, which roles are providing that permission. We can also audit that user access provisioning process, so who's out in the system adding roles or permissions to each user. There's a few different ways to do that. One is with an employee search. There's a couple fields on that employee record that we can look at, including role change action, and role change date. That's going to show us when roles were added to a specific user. Can also look at the employee history tab. So if we open up that employee record and look at the access tab, there's a history sub-tab in there that's going to show you which users have been adding which permissions or roles as on a certain date. Important to note here that global permissions are only going to show up in that history tab. From there, our next control is the system's development lifecycle. So I'll give everybody a few seconds to read that objective. So really the high-level goal here is just making sure that customizations or changes that we're putting in place against our NetSuite environment are going through a standardized, documented, and auditable process. So the typical phases of an SDLC are going to be planning. That's where we're going through and deciding what we're going to do or what change we need to put in place. Then we move on to design, where we're actually deciding how that change is going to be implemented, whether it's custom objects like custom forms and records or scripts or workflows. From there, we move on to development. So development is obviously going to be creation of those customizations. Once development's complete, we go to testing, where we're going to go through a rigorous quality assurance and user acceptance testing processes to determine that what was developed does indeed meet the requirements that were defined during the design and planning phases. From there, if testing looks good, we go to deployment and actually move those changes into production, and from there on out, we just support those changes. So one component of SDLC is going to be that change management process that we just kind of went through a little bit. Change management process is really just going to be that standardized process that we're going to go through for all changes to the system, regardless of size, making sure that each change is documented and auditable. It's going to control how we're moving changes between our NetSuite environments, whether that's from a NetSuite development account into Sandbox into production. That process can vary for each organization, or how we're deciding which suite bundles we're going to deploy and when we're going to install those, and then also tracking the artifacts from each phase. So when we start talking about change management, we're going to have our initiation phase where we're going to have our change request documented using a standardized form. At that point, once it's ready for development, we route that for approval prior to pushing it to the development team. So this is our planning and design phase. Once we're ready there, we move on to development. Developers are going to take the requirements from that change request. They're going to make any kind of development changes that are required in a development environment, check that source code into a source control repository, potentially with gated check-ins. In other words, we have developers creating our scripts or workflows, checking those in and having them reviewed by another developer prior to the check-in being committed. Any kind of documentation built out during the development phase is then attached to the change request. Developers will then approve the process for testing. At that point, it moves to our QA and UAT teams. The deployment team is going to promote those changes to our testing environment. QA and UAT is going to test to validate functionality. Any test plans or test cases are then attached to the change request. Once approved by testing, at that point our deployment admins promote to production during a scheduled release window. We want to make sure that that release window is at least somewhat thought out, so we want to not do that obviously during NetSuite major releases, which are twice a year. We want to make sure we're not doing that when other suite bundles are being updated, and we want to make sure that that coincides with Sandbox refreshes that we might have. At that point, the change request is updated to indicate who and when those changes were deployed. And from there, we can audit those changes. So we're basically going back and making sure that the changes match the requirements from our change request form. And we can do that via System Notes, Audit Trail, and History tab, which we'll get into here in a little bit. So as a part of our SDLC process, we want to make sure that developers' access and duties are segregated between environments and between permissions. So when we start considering which users are going to be included in that SDLC process, first we have our developers, right? We need to make sure that they have access to the environments they need access to in order to develop the customizations. Typically that's going to be a development or Sandbox account, including source control repositories. Typically they're not going to need access to production systems unless an emergency arises where they need to jump in and get your system back up and running. And then it's important that their access is removed entirely if they're not actively working on a project. We have our QA and UAT teams. They're going to have access to sandboxes where the testing takes place. UAT is typically going to consist of users that are impacted by these changes that have the necessary access to the necessary job functions to test out functionality. And then your deployment admins. QA and UAT and development are not going to have the ability, or they should not have the ability to promote changes between environments. That should be left to a specific team of deployment administrators that are going to have access to all the environments required in order to promote code between those environments. It's important as a part of your SDLC process to have your NetSuite environments determined and determine where each action is going to take place within each environment. And there's a few different options within NetSuite. Oftentimes there'll be the single production instance of NetSuite. There can be one or more sandboxes, and then there can be one or more development accounts. So it's important to understand the difference between those development accounts and those sandboxes. Development accounts are not going to have production data, but they will have the same features and provisioned suite apps as production. Typically they're spun up for an individual project. They can have 10 users at most. Your sandboxes are typically where QA and UAT is going to take place. They can be refreshed with production data. Part of the reason that they're typically, at least best practices to not use them for development, is that they can be refreshed. So it's important to make sure that if you are refreshing those and using them for development, that will overwrite anything you have in development in the environment prior to it being deployed, to our deployment process. So as a part of this process, we said that devs, QA, and UAT should not be deploying between environments. It should be a separate development team. So it's important to know who has access to those deployment permissions and who has access to each account included in those environments. You need to make sure that this process is documented and auditable. So again, we're looking back at that change management process where our change request forms are in play, and also looking at our source control repositories to make sure that code is indeed checked in. And there are a few options that NetSuite can provide as a part of this deployment process. So you can have those development accounts and sandboxes. You can have a combination of those. How you move that how you move those changes through each NetSuite account is important to understand. That can be done via Suite Bundler, which is the current process that's in NetSuite. A new process that's coming out, which is currently in beta. I'm not sure when exactly it's moving out of beta, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was next release, is the Suite Cloud Development Framework. This allows you to take code and move it to multiple environments at the same time, and it's really going to automate that process and eventually replace Suite Bundler entirely. So the last step of that SDLC is once we've gone and deployed changes into our environment, we need to go back and make sure that what was deployed was what was intended to be deployed. So a couple ways to do that is we can look at custom objects first. So this is going to be anything like custom records and custom forms. You can determine changes to these objects by looking at system notes. So if you go and create new save search, you'll see system notes show up as the record type. Within there, you can filter down based on the record type to find specific changes for either custom forms or custom records or custom segments or custom transactions, any of the custom objects that are out there. And it's going to break it down at a field level and show you the old value, new value of each field and who changed it, when they changed it, and how they changed it. So that context UI is going to indicate the NetSuite user interface, but it could be anything. There's a pretty large number of contexts that could apply there. Next is auditing our scripts. So scripts are, the process for auditing scripts is a little more involved. Scripts are going to consist of 3 different components. First, we're going to have our source files. So the source files are going to be JavaScript and other files that make up the business logic that's contained in the script. These files are stored typically in your NetSuite file cabinet, usually in the Suite Scripts or Suite Bundles folder. Then we're going to have our script record. The script record is going to link back to the specific source file or more source files, and it's going to define the type of script, so whether it's a user event, a scheduled script, and it's also going to determine which script files it links to back in the file cabinet. And then we get to the script deployment record. The script deployment record is going to define how the script is triggered, including who can trigger that script, which is known as the audience. That can be broken down to specific users, specific roles, specific subsidiaries. Without a script deployment record, scripts will not run. So it's important to remember that each of these components is audited individually within NetSuite. So first off, we get to our source files. So there's a few different ways to look at those. First off is in NetSuite by looking at, again, our system notes against the documents and files record type. From there, we can look specifically at JavaScript files to see when they were last changed and who changed them. So anything as a part of a deployment will show up here, or if those scripts are modified directly in production from the script record or the JavaScript file, this will show up here as well. So you can start to get a good idea of who's been in modifying your source code. It's important to note, though, that specific line changes are not going to show up in this system note report. Those are going to be back in whatever source code repository you're using. For the script and script deployment records, as of 2016.2, NetSuite did add system notes to these record types, so you can use that for determining when changes were made and who made them. Then finally we get the workflows. So workflows are kind of the weak link here. They don't currently have system note support, though it is, from what I hear, going to be added very soon. But you can use some of the tools within NetSuite to track changes to these. So first off, you can use saved searches, again, to determine the last time a workflow was changed. And then from there, individual changes are available on the individual workflow in the History tab. As of the latest release, NetSuite also added the ability to download XML definitions of workflows, which can then be loaded into source control repositories. Typically, a source control repository is going to include functionality to compare files, which could be used to determine where changes were made to a given workflow. So lastly, we get into transaction processing controls. So really here, we're going to be looking at the input, processing, and output of those controls, or of those transactions, with different controls aligned to each one of those stages. So if we look first at our input, some of the controls that are going to align here would be access controls. So this is going to ensure that the transaction data getting into your system is indeed valid. So here you're making sure that the users are assigned correct permissions. Obviously, if users don't need access to create invoices, they don't have that permission to create invoices. That's your first stop. From there, we get into workflows. Workflows are often used to determine how transactions are routed through the system, whether they're going for multiple approvals or not. Workflows are going to be another control in making sure that the transactions getting into the system are valid. We can consider dual authorization for our posting transactions. So typically, NetSuite is going to include a lot of approval processes out of the box that you can either use. There's multiple levels of them. One is just simple approvals where it goes to has to be marked as approved prior to hitting the GL, or you can build customized approval processes with workflows in NetSuite where transactions can be routed in a pretty much endless ways before it gets to the GL. Next step is restricting access to configuration. So configuration in NetSuite, like your accounting preferences, your general preferences, can have a pretty big impact on how transactions flow through the system. So making sure that only the right users have access to that configuration is going to be another step in making sure that transactions that get into the system are indeed valid. From there, we're going to verify that data that's been input to ensure that it is valid and accurate. We can use system notes as well as audit trails. Audit trails in NetSuite are just predefined system note searches that you can use. And then from there we can do continuous monitoring, so you can use saved searches within NetSuite that are going to be sent out. You can schedule saved searches to be sent out via email on a regular basis, and create saved searches that are looking for specific exceptions to send out alerts on a regular basis. Next we get to the processing and output steps of a transaction, and here we're looking at validity, completeness, and accuracy. So the first step is those audit trails. So again, the audit trails are just predefined system note searches. We can use custom saved searches as well, or some of the system reports that are going to report back on the transactions flowing through the system. Next is reconciliation. So that's really just taking the data in NetSuite and reconciling it against an external system to make sure that they match up. Typically this is done for bank accounts. And then data analytics, typically using an external diagnostic tool or an add-on to NetSuite to look at data for unusual dates, times, amounts, and users. And then here we just have a screenshot of what those audit trails look like within NetSuite. So typically it can be filtered down to a specific record type or specific users. I'm going to show you the date, the time, and what changes were made. So now that we've covered how to do or how to implement these controls using native NetSuite functionality, I just wanted to take a few minutes to cover how you can do the same thing with Fastpath's tool. So for NetSuite, we have a tool called Fastpath Assure that's hosted in the cloud. That's going to make a lot of these controls at least a little bit easier and try to automate your controls and your audit processes. So first off, when we go to user access, we're trying to determine who has access to NetSuite, what they can do with that access. We provide simple canned reports that are going to look at the effective access of all users, including center-based users, and we're going to do that down to the subsidiary level. So we're including that subsidiary analysis to determine which subsidiaries a given user has the permission in, as well as that cumulative access level to determine the greatest access level they have. We make it very easy to navigate around and see how a user is getting a certain permission, whether that's by a role or a global permission, and also provide detailed reports that'll merge all of that information into one spot that can then be exported to Excel or scheduled to be sent out on a regular basis. Our tool also provides the ability to electronically sign off on these reports. So as you're going through your SOC audits, your auditors are going to come in and say, that's great, you have these reports that are looking at user access. How do we know you've actually been looking at them? With our electronic signatures, you can easily show that evidence to your auditors. From there, we also give you the ability to group that user access by risk. This is what we call critical access. You can create as many critical access groups as you want, and they can include one or many NetSuite permissions. So this is typically going to be permissions in NetSuite that you decide are high risk that you want to pay special attention to. So when we talked about SOD, the typical SOD process is 3 steps: define our rules, identify where we have risk, and then document our mitigating controls against those risks. Our tool tries to make that process as automated, as easy as possible. First off, we include a rule set out of the box that our auditors built based on best practices and aligned back to NetSuite permissions. I believe there's about 115 rules out of the box. You can customize that rule set as you see fit for your organization. Once it's defined, we're going in and running user conflict reports that are included in our tool. It's going to take that rule set, it's going to compare it back to user access, all the roles, all the global permissions that are assigned to those users to determine where we have conflicts in the system. And lastly, we give you the ability to document your mitigating controls either at the user conflict level or at the actual conflict level. So if you wanted to document mitigations in bulk. We also have an identity management module within Fastpath. This is going to be at a high level the ability to create, edit, and terminate users. It's a workflow-based process with approval rules that you can customize. It's going to include an SOD analysis as well, so you can see the impact on a request. If I'm granting a new user a role, I want to have an idea of what the impact is going to be on user conflicts. Before I provision that request, we provide you the ability to review those roles or review those conflicts, and also attach effective dates. So the scenario there is I have a consultant coming in, I want them to have access to my system for 3 months for a specific project. With Fastpath Identity Manager, you can come in and create that new user and set an effective date at the user level, or you can set it at the role level to assign and grant that role and user at the specific date you choose, and then automatically revoke them at a later date. So the idea here is obviously to try to reduce the risk in your user access by getting rid of orphaned users in an automated fashion. And then lastly, Fastpath Audit Trail for NetSuite, trying to answer the question here of what your users are doing in NetSuite. We include some enhanced system note reporting on master and transactional data. Not trying to replace system notes entirely, really we're just trying to make those system notes easier to consume. And we also provide the ability to see changes made by users who had the administrator role at the time they made that change, including all changes to security, so you can see which users are granting and revoking roles and global permissions. Well, I hope the webinar was helpful this afternoon. Now that we're at the end, I wanted to open it up for questions because it looks like we have about 10 or 15 minutes left here.
Thanks so much, Zach. Just a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the question or chat box, or you can actually raise your hand and we'll unmute you as well. One person did ask about if they didn't have Twitter, how to get a copy of the book. You can go ahead and email Zach, whose email address is up there as well. We'll make sure you get that. Zach, it looks like we don't have any questions. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thanks, Zach, for presenting. And feel free to reach out to us if there's anything we can help you with in your NetSuite deployment. Thanks, everybody.